Ever wondered what it would be like to discover something new every single day? Welcome to my channel, where curiosity leads the way. From interesting ideas to engaging content, there's always something here for you. Make sure to subscribe and be part of this journey of discovery.
My name is Michael Hartley. I spent 22 years as a civil engineer, building bridges for a living. There's something deeply ironic about that now. My wife Sylvia and I met in our late 20s at a friend's 4th of July cookout. She laughed at something I said that wasn't even that funny, and I was done for. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Charlotte, and built what I genuinely believed was a good life. We had 2 kids, our son, who was 15 at the time this story starts, and our daughter, who was 17. I worked hard, coached Little League for 6 years, drove to every school play and every soccer tournament. Sylvia taught 3rd grade. We were, by every outward measure, fine. Looking back, I can see the cracks I chose not to look at. Sylvia had started staying late after school. She joined a professional development group that met Thursday evenings. She started working out again and bought new clothes she didn't model for me. When I'd try to pull her close in bed, she'd say she was tired, and I believed her because I was tired too, and because I didn't want to believe anything else. I came home early on the Tuesday in March. A water main had burst near the job site, and we'd been sent home at noon. I remember thinking I'd surprise her, maybe take her to lunch. Her car was in the driveway. So was one I didn't recognize, a newer silver pickup with a college parking sticker on the back window. I sat in my own driveway for almost a full minute, then I drove to a gas station 2 blocks away and parked. I called her cell. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice completely normal, told me she had a headache and had come home early from school. I said I hoped she felt better and that I'd see her that evening. I drove to a park nearby and sat on a bench for 3 hours. When I finally came home, the silver truck was gone. Sylvia was in the kitchen making dinner like it was any other day. I asked how her head felt. She said much better. I set my work bag down and went to change my clothes, and I didn't say a single word about what I'd seen. I'm not proud of how long it took me to move. It was another 6 weeks of watching her, noticing things, building a picture I didn't want to see completed. Her phone tilted away when I walked by. A name, Philip, coming up repeatedly in her school emails, which she didn't know I could access because I'd set up the family computer. Phil became the name I couldn't stop seeing. I found a family law attorney named Susan before I said a word to Sylvia. I met with her on a Friday afternoon and laid everything out. We were in a fault state, which mattered. My attorney told me to document as much as I could before making any move, so I did. On a Thursday evening in May, Sylvia was getting ready to leave for her development group. I asked if she could stay home that night, that I wanted to talk. She said it was important, she'd already committed. We'd talk when she got back. I said fine, please come home at a reasonable hour. She came home at 1 in the morning. I was sitting in the living room in the dark when she walked in. She actually startled when she saw me. I asked her to sit down. She asked why I was being dramatic. I told her I needed to say something and I needed her to hear it clearly. I told her I knew about Philip. I told her I'd seen his truck. I told her I knew she hadn't had a headache in March. I kept my voice even. I'd rehearsed this more times than I can count. Her face went through 4 or 5 different expressions before it landed on something like resignation. Then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, I wasn't going to keep this from you forever. I just needed to figure out what I wanted first. I want you to understand what it feels like to hear that sentence from someone you've spent 22 years building a life with. She wasn't asking forgiveness. She was explaining a process. Like she was a customer who hadn't decided between 2 menu items yet. I told her I wanted a divorce. She said she wasn't sure she did. I told her it wasn't up to her anymore. What I did next was what my attorney had told me to do. The next morning, before Sylvia woke up, I sat our daughter down in the kitchen. I made her breakfast. I told her that her mother and I were going to be separating, that it wasn't her fault or her brother's fault, and that I loved her completely. I told her the truth about why, in plain, age-appropriate terms. I said her mother had been seeing someone else, and I wasn't able to stay in the marriage because of it. I didn't editorialize. I didn't cry in front of her, though I wanted to. She sat very still for a long moment and then asked if I was going to be okay. That broke me a little. I picked my son up from baseball practice that afternoon and told him in the truck, same way. He asked if it was his coach, which was such a teenage boy thing to wonder that I almost laughed. I said no. It was someone from her school. He was quiet the whole drive home. When we pulled into the driveway, he said, Dad, You didn't do anything wrong." I have no idea how he knew to say that, but I've replayed it probably 1,000 times since. I did this first, before Sylvia had a chance to call her mother, before she could sit the kids down with her version. My attorney had specifically said, get your story in clearly, calmly, and first. Don't let someone else control the narrative. Sylvia was furious when she found out I'd talked to them. She said I had poisoned them and that I had no right to involve the children. I said they were my children too, and that they deserved the truth from me rather than a version of events that conveniently left out what she'd done. She went to her sister's that night. Philip, it turned out, was an assistant principal at a middle school across town, 34 years old to Sylvia's 43. I mention his age only because she mentioned it to me, specifically as though it were relevant information I'd want to know. She said he made her feel young. I said I was sorry she'd felt old and that she could have simply said so rather than what she chose to do instead. She didn't have an answer for that. The divorce process was brutal in the way divorces are when one person wants out and the other is embarrassed and scared. She contested the fault grounds first. Her attorney argued it was a brief, emotional affair. My attorney introduced the parking records from her school, the hotel receipt I'd found, and screenshots of emails she had no idea I'd kept. The fault grounds held. Because we were in a fault state and the fault was established, the asset division leaned in my favor in ways it wouldn't have otherwise. She had wanted to keep the house. I did not want to keep the house, and I didn't fight her on it, but I also didn't just hand it to her. We negotiated my equity out, which came to just over $90,000. I signed over the house and moved into a 2-bedroom rental across town. My daughter came with me. She packed a bag the week after I moved in and asked if she could stay there for a while. I said of course, and set up the 2nd bedroom the way she liked. She went to her mother's on weekends, but she lived with me. My son stayed with Sylvia during the school year because of baseball, but he came to me most weekends and every school break. That wasn't what the custody arrangement said, technically, but it was what they chose, and I wasn't going to argue with what they chose. Here is where I will be honest with you. The first year was very bad. Not dramatic bad, not screaming at the ceiling bad. Just quietly, steadily bad. I worked. I came home to a rental apartment. I cooked dinner for 1 or 2 people depending on the night. I went to bed. I woke up and did it again. My daughter would sometimes sit with me in the evenings and watch old westerns, which she'd never expressed any interest in before, and which I think she watched purely because it meant she didn't have to talk. I was grateful for that. That didn't date. I wasn't ready, and I knew I wasn't ready, and I'm proud of myself for knowing that. What I did instead was rebuild something I'd let go to ruin, my father's 1969 Ford Bronco, which had been sitting under a tarp in my sister's garage for 11 years. My father had bought it the year I was born. When he passed, no one could figure out what to do with it, so it just sat. I had it towed to a rented shop space, and I started taking it apart. I want to be clear that I did not have a plan for it. I just needed something to do with my hands that was not thinking about Sylvia. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, Philip moved into the house I had built equity in for 15 years. I heard this from my daughter, who told me with the particular flat tone teenagers use when they're trying to tell you something that might hurt you but they think you need to know. I thanked her for telling me. Then I went out to the shop and replaced every piece of the Bronco's brake system, which it didn't strictly need yet, but I needed to do something with my hands. I filed a motion to modify spousal support the following week. My attorney had told me this might be an option once a partner moved in. It wasn't automatic. We were in a state where it required showing a reduction in her financial need. But we made the argument and won it. The modification saved me about $600 a month. I'm not going to pretend the money was the point. It wasn't entirely the point. A friend from my job site asked me to come to a car show in the spring of that 2nd year. I almost said no. I had been saying no to most things for about 14 months at that point, but I had the Bronco running by then, a little rough, but running, and he said I should bring it and see what people thought. So I went. I sat up next to a woman who had a beautifully restored 1971 Scout, olive green, completely bone stock. She knew exactly what she had, and she wasn't trying to impress anyone with it. Her name was Colleen. She had a teenage son with her. 16, quiet kid, interested in the Scout's engine and not much else. We talked for a while about the Scout, then about the Bronco, then about nothing in particular. She was direct and a little dry and didn't ask me anything personal. We had coffee at the show and exchanged numbers and agreed to talk about the cars more sometime. Her son gave me a small nod when they left that I interpreted, correctly as it turned out, as approval. I won't go through all of it because it wasn't dramatic. Colleen and I became friends first, Then more than that, slowly, in the way things happen when you're in your mid-40s and you've already been hurt, and you're not in any particular hurry. She'd been divorced for 4 years. Her son thought I was acceptable, which from a 16-year-old boy is about as warm as it gets. About a year and a half after the car show, I asked her to marry me. In the shop, which she always said smelled like her grandfather's garage. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We got married that fall in a small ceremony. My daughter was there. My son was there. Colleen's son was a groomsman and looked genuinely uncomfortable in the suit, which made me like him even more. It was 40 people in the backyard of a friend's property, and it was perfect. Now I need to tell you about the part I didn't expect. About 8 months after Colleen and I married, my son called me from a parking lot at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. He was 20 by then, in his second year of college. He said he needed to talk to me and asked if he could come over. I said of course. He showed up 45 minutes later and sat in my kitchen and told me that Philip had moved out, that his mother and Philip had broken up, and that in the aftermath of it he had learned some things he hadn't known before. He'd found out that the affair had started much earlier than any of us knew. Not months before I'd seen the truck. Years. Sylvia had kept a second email account that my son had found referenced in a printed document she'd left on the kitchen counter, and when he looked into it, the dates didn't line up with anything she'd told him or anyone else. The development group had started almost 3 years before I saw that silver truck in my driveway. He sat across from me at my kitchen table looking like he was waiting for me to be angry. I wasn't angry. I was just tired in a particular way that I think only makes sense to people who've been through something like this. The kind of tired that comes from realizing you'd already understood something true for a long time and had simply been waiting for the confirmation of it. I told him that I was glad he told me. I told him none of that changed anything about the way I felt about him or his sister. I told him that his mother was still his mother and always would be, and that his relationship with her was his own to figure out. He nodded. He stayed for dinner. Colleen made pasta. The three of us watched a Western. Here's the part about Philip I should include because it matters to the story. About a year after he moved out of what used to be my house, there was an incident at his school. I am not going to say more than what was public record. There was a formal complaint, an investigation, and he resigned his position. I did not cause that. I had nothing to do with it. I'm telling you about it only because it happened and because Sylvia called me after it did. She called to tell me about Philip because I think she needed to tell someone who wouldn't judge her. We hadn't spoken in over 2 years. She said she was embarrassed. She said she realized she'd made choices she couldn't undo and that she'd hurt people who didn't deserve it. I said I knew. There was a long pause. She asked if there was any chance I could forgive her. I said I had forgiven her, actually, some time ago, not for her benefit, but for mine. I said that forgiveness wasn't an invitation back to anything. She said she understood. That was the last real conversation we had for about 6 months. The following spring, my daughter graduated college. We had a dinner afterward. My daughter, my son, Colleen's son, and me. Sylvia came too because my daughter had asked if she could, and I had said of course. It was at a steakhouse downtown that my daughter had picked because she'd heard they had good onion rings. It was strange, and then it was fine. Sylvia was quieter than I'd ever seen her. She sat at the far end of the table and she watched her children laughing, and she looked like someone reckoning with a loss she'd brought on herself. I didn't enjoy that exactly, but I noticed it. Colleen put her hand on mine under the table at one point, and that was enough. After dinner, in the parking lot, Sylvia pulled me aside for a moment. She asked how I was. I said I was well, genuinely. She looked at Colleen through the restaurant window, who was talking to my daughter about something that was making my daughter laugh. Sylvia said, "She seems like a good person." I said she was. Sylvia nodded. She said, "I'm glad for you. I mean that." And then she got in her car and drove away. I stood there in the parking lot for a minute after her taillights disappeared. I'd spent a long time waiting for the moment when I'd feel something decisive about all of it. Rage, or vindication, or the clean snap of a door finally closing. What I felt in that parking lot was something smaller and more useful than any of that. I felt like a man who had built something worth standing in. I drove home. Colleen was already there when I walked in. The kitchen light was on. My son had left the jacket on the chair by the door, which he always did and which I always moved without saying anything. I moved it. I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I have a good life. It took longer than I wanted. It cost more than I expected. But I built it the same way I build everything. one piece at a time, making sure each part could bear weight before I put the next one on. There's a saying I've heard 100 times: the best revenge is a life well lived. I used to think that was something people said because they couldn't think of any actual revenge. I don't think that anymore. I've thought a lot about what actually broke Sylvia and me. Not the affair, that was the symptom. What broke us was that she had decided, somewhere along the way, that her own comfort was more important than the promises she'd made. That's not a character flaw unique to her. Plenty of people make that same calculation. What made it devastating was that she made it quietly, over years, while I was still operating as though we had an agreement. That's the thing about betrayal that nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in, and by the time you see it clearly, you realize you've been living inside a version of your life that wasn't entirely real. What I learned from all of it, from finding out about Philip, from sitting with my son in the truck in the driveway, from the long, quiet evenings in a rental apartment, is that the choices you make in the worst moments of your life are the ones that actually define you, not the big dramatic decisions, the small ones. Whether you tell your children the truth calmly, or whether you use them as weapons, whether you walk into a lawyer's office with documentation, or whether you blow up and hand the other side ammunition, whether you spend your evenings working on something with your hands, or whether you spend them drowning. I chose every day to behave like someone my kids could respect. Not because I'm noble, because I knew even then that my children were watching me figure out how to lose with dignity. And I still believe, that how a person handles losing tells you everything about who they actually are. Sylvia made choices that cost her enormously, not because the universe punished her, but because actions have weight. Every lie she told added to a structure that was eventually going to collapse under its own load. Philip turned out to be exactly the kind of man that was always going to end badly. The community standing she'd built as a teacher took years to erode, but erosion is patient. None of that was something I arranged. I just stayed out of the way and let the physics of her choices work. My son telling me he was proud of me that first night, sitting in the truck, that mattered more to me than any settlement figure, any legal victory, any moment of watching Sylvia reckon with what she'd lost. Because it meant he'd seen something real in me when I was under pressure. That's the only inheritance I actually care about leaving. Colleen did not fix me. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to read this story as one where a good woman comes in and makes everything whole again. What Colleen did was show up after I had already done the work of fixing myself. There's a difference. The shop, the Bronco, the 2 years of quiet, difficult living. That came first. She came after. That order matters. If you're in the middle of something like this right now, here's the only thing I know for certain. The person you are when nobody is watching, when the kids are asleep and the apartment is quiet and there's nothing to distract you from the weight of it. That person is who you actually are. Build that person carefully. The rest has a way of following.